This is a way of dealing with the facts of the matter. And the confluence is where it intersects with memory. Now, my memory of 1968 is not as great as others because I was an adolescent at the time, but it's still a memory. And the reason you need history, in fact, is the balance that those things which we may not remember accurately. I know some of you, others I don't, and I'm happy to see all of you. I am the host of a new podcast called Heat and Light. The idea, of course, is to reflect on the extraordinary emotions of 1968, but also to try to elucidate what those emotions reflected and what was happening in that pivotal year, a watershed year indeed, because of things that you know about and perhaps some events that you may not be aware of or aware of but know very little about. We all think of 1968, of course, in terms of the Mexico City students, the uprisings across Africa that was part of the decolonization period that was continuing at that period. We know 1968 for the Chicago SDS and police riots during the Democratic National Convention. But some of the stories that we tried to tell in Heat and Light are less known. Heat and Light is a product of the Conversation U.S. Who's familiar with the Conversation U.S.? I'm happy to see some folks are. Well, this is an attempt to bring in academics from around the world. The Conversation U.S. is basically a newsroom in which the academics, educators, are the reporters. Reporting in a way that touches and connects to ordinary folk, but also connects to other experts. And you can find the Conversation U.S., of course, online by simply going to the Conversation U.S. We have counterparts in Australia, in Indonesia, in France, and in the U.K. I'm actually not an employee of the Conversation. I just feel like one. As I said before, I work at WGBH. Continuing with Heat and Light, the idea was to introduce a podcast that was a confluence, if you will, of both history, which can basically work in terms of pointing to facts, coming close to objective history as possible. Of course, there's revisionism. You have to deal with that. But this is a way of dealing with the facts of the matter. And the confluence is where it intersects with memory. Now, my memory of 1968 is not as great as others because I was an adolescent at the time. But it's still a memory. And the reason you need history, in fact, is the balance that those things which we may not remember accurately. Those are impressions of time. And Heat and Light, of course, I do remember the emotions of the time. I remember National Guardsmen coming down my street in Detroit in both 67 and in 68. Tanks rolling down 12th Street. I remember the fires just down the street because I happened to be raised in an area that was the start in two different periods of both the 1967 uprising, some people call it riots, and the 1968 uprising, some people call it riots. And that is part of this discussion, how we refer to that period. Heat and Light, we introduced 7 episodes. Among the episodes that we looked at was looking at Silicon Valley and the start of Silicon Valley. Its provenance could, in fact, be traced to a fella named William Shockley, who years later had, of course, invented the chip. Oh boy, you've got it bad today. Maybe that's 3 hours of sleep will do it. I'm sorry? Silicon, that's right. Thank you very much. But he was also known, of course, for for promulgating concepts of genetic and inferiority and superiority, modern-day eugenicists, if you will. But Silicon Valley is one of the issues and one of the events, one of the watershed periods, and one watershed, I should say, things that occurred in 1968. 1968 also, we trace the start of the conservative evangelical movement and its alliances with GOP politics. A lot of people trace those alliances to the 1970s with Richard Nixon, but it actually preceded Richard Nixon. And we talk about that also, that alliance, those allegiances in 1968. But 1968 was also the year of the first interracial kiss on national television in the United States. The French were way ahead of us, of course, and other countries. But the United States, this was absolute taboo. It's a year after the Loving case of Virginia, in Virginia versus Loving. You remember that case, which was an attempt to basically, on Virginia's part, to codify its laws, basically condemning and prohibiting miscegenation, as it was the term is known. Loving, the couple, won this case, but it was still seen as absolutely problematic for many people, not just in the South, but across the country, to engage in interracial relationships outside of shaking hands, and so on and so forth. And the Loving case was the precursor to that. That same year as Loving, of course, was a movie called Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? Well, guess what happened in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? There was no intimacy. It happened only in a television show. And anyone know what that television show was? If you haven't heard Heated Light. It was sci-fi. Star Trek, of course. I'm going to play a little excerpt from Heat and Light. Matt, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Your specialty is absolutely intriguing because you're talking about the intersection, in many ways, of history and memory. You've written about the first interracial kiss on television. What did it look like and how was it received?
So the first interracial kiss on television was Star Trek. It's in 1968. And it's between Captain Kirk, played by William Shatner, and Lieutenant Uhura, played by Nichelle Nichols. And it's a really odd episode. It's an episode called Plato's Stepchildren. The Enterprise crew travels to this foreign planet, an alien planet, where all the people there worship Plato, the philosopher Plato. But they also have powers of telekinesis. So they're able to take mind control over the crew of the Enterprise. And the whole episode is set up that the aliens on this planet are controlling the Enterprise crew and forcing them to do things they wouldn't otherwise do. So that's the setup in which this kiss takes place. So their Enterprise crew is asked to perform this play, and they force William Shatner's character and Nichelle Nichols' character to embrace and then eventually to kiss.
And why don't we take a listen to that episode?
Now, let the revels begin.
So it's kind of an auditorium setting, and you have the acolytes of Plato watching the audience while the crew of the Enterprise is putting on this play while they're under mind control. So if you can process all that. Captain Kirk is wearing a toga and a laurel wreath around his head. Lieutenant Uhura has a relatively skimpy dress on, and her hair is in a kind of bouffant, so it's very stylized. What's interesting, though, is because they're under mind control, they don't want to be embracing. So their language is they keep saying, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do this, no, I don't want this to be happening.
I'm so frightened, Captain. I'm so very frightened.
That's the way they want you to feel. Makes them think that they're alive.
While they're showing these two characters embracing, they'll then cut to the Plato's acolytes, the aliens who are watching this, and they are at turns kind of stimulated and horrified. So it's this very interesting spectacle that's going on. Eventually, after nearly a minute of Captain Kirk and Lieutenant Uhura being sort of in this embrace and trying to resist it, they put their cheeks together, they're looking off into the distance.
I'm thinking of all the times on the Enterprise when I was scared to death. And I would see you so busy at your command. And I would hear your voice from all parts of the ship. And my fears would fade. And now they're making me tremble. But I'm not afraid. I am not afraid.
But then they're compelled to kiss. And then they cut to a final reaction shot of Plato's acolytes, who, again, are kind of titillated and slightly horrified by what they've seen.
Now, needless to say, this particular episode and much of Star Trek in 1968 did not age that well. Your first reaction, of course, is to laugh at this scene. It's so absolutely ridiculous in the context of today. But in 1968, of course, as we all know, this was a period that was remarkable in United States history. It was a continuation, the last vestiges of Jim Crow, codified racism, anti-democratic norms in the South. And among the tenets of Jim Crow, that which was heavily militated against, perhaps the thing that was most militated against was, of course, interracial relationships. It's suggested to many people the end of not just of an era, but of an order, of the way things should be, so on and so forth. So I can tell you right now, my first reaction when I saw the clip, and of course I chuckled. I mean, it's hilarious. But then I thought about, these the time again, 1968. I had a youthful memory of that time, but many others, their memory was of some of the most brutal reactions to this type of thing in real life that you can imagine. We still had lynchings in 1968. We still had, even though Martin Luther King and others had accomplished a great deal with the Voting Rights Act and with other aspects of the civil rights movement that were a part of our legal processes, there were still episodes, many, many episodes in the South where people's lives were still dictated by this thing we know as Jim Crow, American apartheid. So to show something like this on national television in 1968, it produced a reaction that you can imagine. CBS was flooded with negative calls, where people were aghast that this was something that would be allowed on television. Ministers protested in New York. You had a situation where some of the producers were threatened. Gene Roddenberry, he was asked, how could you do such a thing? So on and so forth. Of course, there was also acceptance by other segments of American society that saw this as a way of pushing change on the issue of race. So it was important for this particular podcast to introduce this particular subject as, again, one of the largely unknown aspects of 1968, which was impactful. And which also allowed us to look at race in a different way. A more brutal aspect of racism, of course, was exemplified in 1968 in April of that year by the assassination of America's foremost civil rights leader and one of America's foremost leaders, Martin Luther King Jr. We had just experienced months earlier the riots/uprisings in Detroit in 1967, which the Curter Commission report later attributed largely to police violence and municipal neglect in Detroit. Of course, these were uprisings that were occurring across the country. And this resulted in 1968, a lot of people don't know this, in yet another episode of violence in the streets in Detroit. Just months, not quite a year, after the uprisings in July and in Detroit of '67, considered the deadliest in the country, officially more than 39 killed, unofficially more than 50 killed in that particular episode. But 1968, you saw something similar. The word went out that Martin Luther King had been killed, and no sooner were academics and others trying to figure out what had caused the uprisings, riots of 1967 than you had 1968. I'm going to play that.
This was a place that was a center of activity for black political empowerment here in Detroit. The cops historically would just issue a ticket to whoever the proprietor was, but in this case, they decided to put everybody in cuffs and march them down the stairs and put them in paddy wagons.
And that's the sound that you're hearing all over Detroit this evening. In these areas that have been hit by earlier sniping, that one closer.
It was one of the deadliest uprisings in our nation's history. It happened in my hometown, and I have vivid memories of it. I'm Phillip Martin, and this is Heat and Light. We bring you the stories you may not have heard about last century's most pivotal year, 1968.
We have a pointing device called a mouse.
Just what do you think you're doing, Dave?
In this episode, we'll transport you to the city of my birth, a city that has become a metaphor for both blight and resurgence, the city of Detroit. In 1968, the streets of the Motor City were still smoldering from the summer before. The riot, the uprising, the rebellion. However you characterize the violence of that period, one thing was sure. Residents were fired up.
The spark, as always, was a minor incident. It was routine police action, a raid on what Detroiters call a blind pig, an after-hours bar.
So, as you point out, there was this speakeasy, there was this blind pig, but this was a place that was a lot more than an after-hours bar. This is maybe one of the urban myths I like to talk about, that this was not, a bunch of kids that were celebrating the return of some Vietnam vets, and they just sort of all squatted in an upstairs area. This was a place that was a center of activity for black political empowerment in the 12th Street area.
A sleazy strip of pawn shops and bars, a haven for pimps and prostitutes, junkies and gamblers.
There were a number of African-American folks who lived in the 12th and Claremont area. This is a place that was really a refuge for the African-American community, and where they could sort of trade information on jobs, trade information on places to live. This was a lot more than a blind pig.
And it was about 900 yards from where I grew up. That's the most remarkable thing about history. When you recount history and you think, wow, I lived right across the street from this place. But what was really important for this particular podcast, and what was advantageous, was you have a lot of archival tape in order to bring this sound and to bring that period to life. If you weren't there, if you weren't even born, you at least get an idea, an impression, a snapshot, if you will, and hopefully more of what was happening in 1968. Now, we could have chosen a lot of years, of course. There are a lot of watershed years of the 20th century. But it seems like there's nothing quite like the year that we, of course, are in the, we're celebrating an anniversary this year of 1968, 50 years later. And it's pretty remarkable to think that this year there was just so much wrapped up into one 12-month period that we call history, and that basically had such an extraordinary bearing on our current policies on race, on foreign policy. Of course, we were still in the throes of the Cold War, to say the least, and we were still figuring out this thing we call the Third World and its relationship to the United States. And the next episodes, we're hoping to basically explore what was happening in 1968 outside of the United States, including in Latin America. Brazil just elected don't want to get into that one too much, but someone, the fellow Bolsonaro, who in 1968, of course, you still had the military dictatorship started in 65. It didn't end until 1985, 84, 85. And so many people believe that with Bolsonaro, his election in Brazil just last week, just last Sunday, that this, in fact, is another period in which 1968 becomes very instructive. I'm going to stop right there and...